Hey everybody, what is the role of a product manager in a free-to-play mobile game publishing company? So today we're going to talk to Victor Wang, who is a product manager on the mobile hit Jurassic World Alive and works at NBCUniversal. NBCUniversal is both a game publisher and the owner of marquee IPs such as Jurassic World, Fast and Furious, and The Minions. And today we're going to be talking to Victor about a number of issues related to the role of a product manager in terms of like the scope of responsibilities, the types of analysis that a product manager does, the difference between PMs and producers, how do you break into the industry as a product manager in games, what are some of the skills required to be a great product manager, and what is the future of product management in games. So stay tuned and we'll get right to it. Let's go. Hey everybody, welcome. We are here today with Victor Wang, who is a product manager here at NBCUniversal in the games division. Victor, I thought we could start by just having you explain the role of a product manager and what you do here at NBCUniversal games division.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I'm a product manager here at NBCUniversal, and really sort of at a very high level, my job is to be the business owner across the games that I work on.
Yeah.
So that really means like thinking creatively about how we can drive growth for our games, both from like a user's perspective and a monetization perspective. So as you can imagine, in order to really drive sort of growth across both of those things,
Yeah.
I have to work really closely with cross-functional teams. When you think about users, think about like user acquisition, you think about product marketing, how we can really market our games better to, appeal to a broader group. So work really closely with those teams, and then obviously from a user's perspective, retention's kind of this KPI that a lot of gaming product managers think about. Right. So thinking about strategies on how we can like make that better for our games. So working closely with our game development teams and then working closely with designers on creating these features that are really fun for our games so we can drive kind of growth in those particular metrics.
Right, so when you say driving growth and revenue, just so you're basically saying that your job is primarily to sort of own like the business of the game, the monetization and how well the game does in terms of like generating money, right?
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then what does your day-to-day typically look like? So you come into the office, and then what do you kind of on a typical day? What does that look like?
Yeah, so that varies a lot depending on sort of the product lifecycle of the games that I work on.
Yeah.
So I can kind of give you a glimpse as to what my current day-to-day is like right now.
Yeah.
So for context, I'm working on a game that's currently worldwide launched.
Yep.
Has been worldwide launched for 6 months now.
Yeah.
And then I'm also working.
Is Jurassic World Alive.
Jurassic World Alive.
Yep.
And then I'm also working on a game that we're about to sort of launch worldwide. So 2 different games at 2 different sort of parts of the life cycle.
Right.
So, with that in mind, I guess the way that I normally start off my days is to just do some light reading on market research, kind of industry news, just to get a pulse of what's happening in the industry.
Yep.
I think it's super important for product managers to kind of set aside time for this because I think all too often, once production gets underway and there's all of these crazy meetings, it's tough to kind of take a step back and think about the industry overall. So I typically like to start my days off that way. But after that, I like to kind of set some time aside to talk with sort of the dev teams that I'm working with.
Right.
So because I'm working on 2 different games with 2 different studios who are at 2 different parts of the globe,
yeah.
I have to sort of think about their schedules as well. So in the morning, I'll have calls with a studio in Montreal to get a sense of how they're indexing on their sprints and sort of progress on the roadmap and that type of thing. And then sort of in the afternoons, I have calls with Australia, with the studio in Australia to sort of do this, to do the same thing. So those are sort of my touch points with the studios that we work with.
Got it.
And then sort of throughout the day, I like to set some time aside to do some data analysis, which is a really important part about being a product manager in games. Really just sitting with the data to see where there are opportunities, to also get a gauge as to whether we've launched a new feature to see how it's actually doing, and get some learnings behind that. So set some time aside for that, and then obviously meetings with other key stakeholders to push kind of my projects forward. And then also setting some time aside to think about kind of experiments that I want to run in our games, right? So especially for a live operated game, a game that's been out, there's a lot of opportunity for optimization on those fronts. So for Jurassic World Alive, for instance, I'm thinking about the experiments that we can run to get some more learnings about our users.
Right. Yeah. So kind of sounds like high level, if I were to kind of summarize that, it's like reading and learning to keep up to date on the industry.
Yeah.
Meetings with the developers so that you can kind of stay in sync with the product. Third, sounds like you were doing a lot of data analysis to kind of analyze how the games are doing. And then fourth is like, you mentioned experiments, like coming up with ways of like running experiments or trying to figure out how to make the games even better. Is that
exactly fair? That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And sort of to talk more about that last piece, it's about kind of optimization, just quote unquote, like overall. Yeah. So whether that's through experiments or just making sure that, with a feature that we're putting out, we're making improvements to that.
Yeah.
It's sort of thinking about that from an analytical approach.
And then in a lot of companies, there's kind of this role of product manager, and then there's also like this role of producer.
Yeah.
And different companies, the PM and the producer, like that role can be different at different companies, and sometimes even within the same company, it could be different.
Yeah.
And so from your experience, could you talk about, what is a typical difference between a product manager and a producer?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, having been in the games industry for the past few years, you're totally right. It can be very different at different companies. So actually prior to NBCUniversal, I was at a company called Scopely, which is also a publisher, but on the game that I was working on, it was more so on the dev side, I guess you can call it.
Right.
So when you think about sort of the dev side and the publisher side, the role of a producer and a product manager is quite different.
Okay.
Actually, in fact, on the dev side, there's kind of this conundrum around product manager and designer.
Okay.
And sort of those roles kind of blend a little bit as well. Right. So just focusing on producer and product manager, if you sort of think about it like as a Venn diagram, there's definitely a lot of overlap.
Right.
And I think the overlap is sort of on just kind of game design expertise and just thinking about the user first. Like that's just constant across both of those titles.
Okay.
But from my experience, producers are more so on kind of the day-to-day task management. Mm-hmm. So quote unquote, like a project manager, that's sort of the approach and the structure that I'm sort of used to at Scopely.
Right.
And that's sort of kind of, at NBCUniversal, that's sort of the case here as well.
Okay.
But producers are more so thinking about kind of the task management, just kind of running the sprints, making sure that stuff's on track, just thinking about resource management, that type of thing. And another thing that I'll note is depending on the product lifecycle, the producers are sort of driving the pre-production and production stages of game development.
Okay.
Whereas the product managers kind of thinking about once we actually soft launch and worldwide launch, that's sort of when the keys are handed over to the product manager, so to speak.
Got it.
And that's when the optimization and sort of like the KPI setting and the KPI kind of getting these KPIs is sort of where it gets handed over to the product manager.
Got it.
So I think depending on the product lifecycle, the responsibilities differ. But something that I'll also note with product managers is that something that product managers are really good for is just thinking about how to connect the dots across a lot of the different teams. So thinking about how user acquisition kind of feeds into your game's KPIs, thinking about how product marketing kind of feeds into that as well.
Right.
And I keep on saying KPIs, but like that's sort of like you're the KPI owner, so like you're just always thinking of how to kind of drive growth in those KPIs as a product manager.
Right,
so.
and for people in our audience who don't know what a KPI is, can you explain what is a KPI, key performance indicator, like some examples?
Yeah, so like you said, it's key performance indicators, and there's a lot of KPIs you can look at from a games perspective.
Yeah.
And usually the approach that we like to take as product managers in kind of dividing those KPIs down into like more digestible things to look at is to start off with the really big ones, right? So you have like DAU, which is your daily active users, and then you sort of have the monetization side of things, which is like your ARPDAU, right? Average revenue per daily active user.
Right.
So then those are sort of like how revenue is split up into those two different metrics.
Right.
And then you can start thinking about how you can drive improvements in both of those metrics and like kind of deconstruct them down into some kind of smaller pieces.
Right.
So like on the DAU side of things, you can divide that up into your retention and sort of the installs you're pumping into the funnel.
Right.
So the more and more you break it down, the more and more the clearer it becomes in terms of like how you can affect those metrics.
Got it.
So like the more installs you bring into the mix, and this is pretty intuitive, but the more DAU you'll potentially have,
Right.
all things equal.
Right.
So yeah, those are KPIs.
Got it. So it kind of sounds like, again, just for simplification, it sounds like the way you're describing it, and again, this is different in different companies, but one general way to think about it is producers have a little bit of a heavier focus in terms of the development of the game, and then the PMs have a little bit of a heavier emphasis on the optimization of the game and more around the revenue and the P&L. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's like a good general statement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned you worked at Scopely. Just having known you, I know you also worked at Amazon.
Yeah.
And so maybe we could also talk about the role of a product manager and how it's different for you here at NBCUniversal versus another game publisher like Scopely, and then for another company like Amazon, which is outside of the gaming industry. Like, what have been some of those product manager role differences in these different companies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think with product management in general, there's just like, it's tough to define what it is because it is so different for companies. And then like, just thinking about what product management looks like at a tech company like Amazon and compare that to what PM is like at a gaming company, that's very different as well, right? The thing I'll say about product management at Amazon is that there's a very strong PM culture there. It seems like almost everyone's a PM there. And you get to work on very specific problems across like sort of the Amazon like landscape. So like you could be the PM of like the Amazon Prime like shipping like process. And then you can just own that and sort of be sort of like the major one that's kind of driving improvements in that. So I think it's interesting that their approach there. I think what attracted me to the gaming industry is the fact that there's kind of these daily active users you can always get some learnings about. And for like a company like Amazon, it's tough to get that instant feedback on the things that you're doing.
Got it.
And I think that's really what's so awesome about the gaming industry, because you get this feedback on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, on the things that your users are doing. So I think that's sort of the major difference between working at a tech company like Amazon and like working on products that might not be very digital and just have like other applications to their business. And also working at a gaming company.
Yeah, so. It sounds like the other thing that you're mentioning is kind of like this difference in scale. Like Amazon's such a huge company, massively scaled, and so like the problem you might be solving is like this teeny tiny problem, but if you solve it, it gets solved across millions of shipments of products, for example, and when you're working on a game, I guess you might be able to have a much wider scope in terms of what you're looking at and types of problems that you're solving. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. Yeah, at Amazon, they kind of operate at such a big scale that like a 5% improvement in like any small thing can amount to like millions of revenue. So it makes sense for them to focus on these kind of small problems.
Got it. And so like, just taking like a typical example, if you could like walk me through, so this is a games company launching a new game from conception to pre-production to production to soft launch, worldwide launch, like the different phases of development. Could you walk me through, like, from a PM perspective, where do you get involved and like how does your role change in these different phases of game development?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a good way to divide it up is to think about like sort of 3 different phases, right? Like pre-production, production, and live operations. So pre-production is sort of when we have this idea for a game, we've tested this idea with certain IPs, and we know sort of like the general genre and sort of like the meta behind the game. And that's sort of when we start kind of building these ideas and start kind of synthesizing this stuff. So as a PM in this particular aspect or this particular stage, it's sort of doing a lot of market research, trying to figure out what other games that are similar in the genre are sort of doing, and just kind of understanding the sorts of feature sets that do well to really just influence sort of what it is that we're building and sort of influence it at that particular stage. Also just doing a lot of kind of research on IP and how it resonates with particular audiences and making sure that we're even building the right game for this particular IP. That's sort of where kind of a PM comes into play at this particular stage.
Right.
So it's a lot of market research really at this stage. During the production stages, it's thinking about what it is that we need to build to like really be able to live operate this game like going forward. So like building that foundation like during the production stage. So really working closely with the producers on what that roadmap looks like.
Okay.
And not only thinking about what the game is and like what the features we need to like make the game fun,
right,
but also just thinking about like the pipeline and just thinking about like the tools we'll need to kind of build into that stack in order to actually operate these games once it's worldwide.
Right.
So like thinking about telemetry, like how we build our analytics and making sure that's sound so that once we actually do launch, we have something to look at and can understand it and take learnings from like the kind of the data.
Okay.
So that's sort of like a big focus for PMs at that stage.
Okay.
Also thinking about like systems design and just keeping an eye out for, again, like the monetization piece and making sure that that is sound so that when we actually do launch, like the overall structure around how we monetize makes sense and that there's like a lot of depth there too.
Got it.
So that's sort of like the production stage. It's sort of building the telemetry, building the analytics, and just systems design oversight like during that particular stage.
Okay.
And then for live operations, it's sort of thinking about the KPI optimization, right? Like how do we drive at our goals, our business goals?
Right.
And then also just thinking creatively about how we can kind of drive those KPIs, right?
Okay.
So it's experimentation, it's running different live ops, different types of events and seeing what works for particular users. Right. Just thinking about messaging and how that feeds into the whole kind of live ops process.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Great. So let's say you're working on a game and game's doing well, and then the revenue starts to decline. So as a product manager, you mentioned you're kind of responsible for the revenue side of the game.
Yeah.
What kinds of thinking goes on in your mind as a product manager, and then what are some of the types of analysis that you would apply to try to figure out what's going on and how you could fix this problem?
Yeah. So it's not uncommon to see sort of fluctuations in revenue, and this is something that we're always tracking to make sure that we understand why there are fluctuations and can explain them. So a good product manager will already have the tool set in place so that there isn't analysis that needs to be done like that morning to try to figure out what the problems are.
Okay.
So a good way to think about revenue is again to break it down into its key KPIs, and then sort of bubble that up into revenue and see where the fluctuations are on particular KPIs, right?
Okay.
So like, for instance, you can break down revenue down into DAU and ARPDAU.
Sure.
And then break those down into like smaller metrics.
Right.
So like, for instance, perhaps revenue is down because our install count went down for whatever reason.
Right.
If we see that installs is down by the same amount that revenue is, then we can just focus on that piece of the equation.
Got it.
And focus sort of the investigation on that
Right.
piece. A lot of the time what ends up being the case whenever revenue fluctuates is it fluctuates because of the live ops that you're running. At least from my experience, that's been mostly the case. So you'll actually see that in sort of the per user monetization side of things, which is like the ARPDAU to the equation. So to get to the bottom of those types of situations, a lot of it comes down to looking at sort of conversion, looking at sort of your average revenue per paying user, which is another way to break down ARPDAU into two different kind of metrics. So you can divide it down into those metrics, see how those are looking. And a lot of the time, what I've found is, again, it's sort of the economy management of the game that affects those particular things.
Right.
So something we haven't really talked about is just like these really kind of robust economies that a lot of games are built off of. And it's these economy fluctuations which really affect monetization on a daily basis. So it's taking a look at how you're sourcing your currencies and you're syncing your currencies.
Right.
And in an ideal situation, you'd want to be syncing your currency on every day so that you're taking sort of that currency away from players' wallets, and then that'll be a reason for them to purchase more currency. So that's doing a lot of economy management.
Right.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, again, just to hopefully simplify for the audience, like revenue is going down, so you're trying to think in terms of root cause analysis. One way of doing it is like this, I'll call it a logic tree approach. You're taking the KPI revenue, seeing that that's going down, and then you're doing like KPI decomposition and trying to see where things are going so you can kind of isolate what the problem is.
Yeah.
And then you're also just thinking about, so what are other things that can cause the revenue to go down? It could be the economy, and so you do a number of analysis around how the economy has changed and things of that nature. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Cool. And then how do you think in terms of the role of like PM and the skills that you have as a PM, like is that changing, or like what would you say are like the most important skills that are required to be successful as a PM?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you look at sort of the mobile gaming landscape, you'll see that, you know, there's a lot of companies that think about PM in very different ways. I think from what I can tell, I think a lot of companies are trying to follow the Zynga model in terms of how they recruit PMs.
Okay.
So the Zynga model really stresses kind of like data analytics, like that type of skill set, and like so they favor a lot of people from like iBanking/consulting kind of careers. You also see them kind of recruit a lot of MBAs because they kind of can provide that analytical kind of ability. So I think from that perspective, that's a super valuable skill to have as a PM. And again, just thinking about sort of like the Venn diagram of where producers and like product managers kind of overlap, I think the part that product managers sort of have that isn't an overlap is sort of like that analytical ability and just kind of like thinking about kind of ROI analysis and like what we're doing in our games to like drive performance increases. So I think that first and foremost, that skill is really, really important to have as a PM. And I think, that seems to be sort of the way that the industry is going from what I can tell.
So a lot of focus on the quantitative analysis part.
Yeah.
Then you mentioned like Zynga hires a lot of MBAs. So let's talk about that for a minute. Do you think, like, how helpful is an MBA, or do you think it's required for someone to be successful as, you know, a product manager in the free-to-play games industry? Yeah.
I think, so like my opinion is going to be a little controversial in the sense that I don't think it's necessary to have an MBA. I think,
and by the way, there's like the Slack channel where that argument came up, and there was like all sorts of discussion that kind of blew up. But yeah, it'd be great to see your...
It's funny that I say that because I have an MBA, but I don't think it's actually necessary.
Okay.
The one thing I will say about having an MBA is that it opens up a lot of doors for you.
Right.
And, you know, the really valuable thing with my B-School experience was just getting to meet people like in the gaming industry, right? And just understanding like, okay, this is the type of career that I can have like in the gaming industry. It's sort of somebody coming from B-School experience and wants to like break into this really awesome like product management career, right? So I think from that perspective, it's really great to set up these relationships for you and like get to meet people in the industry. But from like an academic kind of standpoint, it's not super necessary to understand how to be a PM.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit. And you mentioned that one of the projects that you're working on is Jurassic World Alive. And by the way, congratulations. It's, you know, obviously the game's been doing really well. Could you talk about, you know, your experience working on Jurassic World Alive? And in this case, you're working with the developer Ludia, based in Montreal. Like, talk a little bit about that relationship and how you've been working together with Ludia to make such a successful product.
Yeah. So it's been really great working with Ludia because they're super passionate about the project. And you know, whenever I talk with them, like just talking with the designers, they're always like really excited to like introduce these awesome features. So I think working with Ludia has been really, really awesome. I think it still comes with its challenges though, and that's more so a comment around just working with, you know, third-party developers because there's sort of like that distance. You're not in the same office, so communication is so critical to make these relationships really be kind of be solid in the sense that like from an operational standpoint. So I think that has been a key learning for me in the sense that, okay, how do we make communication be as crystal clear as possible? What is the right meeting cadence to have these calls? Setting a clear agenda for each call. I think all too often we can set meetings just to kind of like talk about things, but without a clear agenda for these types of calls, like those calls typically don't go anywhere without a clear agenda. So that's been a bit of a learning process for me because something that I've been used to at my experience at Scopely was sort of first party development because we had our devs in the studio and it was very easy to just kind of, you know, roll my chair over to the designer or the kind of the
dev.
There
was more co-location.
There's more co-location, which made communication obviously very different, right? And so that's been sort of like a bit of an adjustment process for me. I think that's aside from that, I mean, it's been kind of good. It's working with Ludia kind of reminds me a lot of sort of my experience at Scopely, working with just like really kind of tight team, like a really small and tight team, and just getting things done quickly. Yeah.
So basically, I guess the lessons here are that one, relationships are very important.
Yeah.
In that, how you communicate can be pretty critical to how effective the working relationship is.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so you've been here at NBCUniversal for how long?
Man, it's been like 8 months.
Okay, so not super long, but
yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about NBCUniversal. Like, what attracted you to the position here, and what do you like most about working at NBC?
Yeah. So, when I first got put onto NBCUniversal, Sean from our team was the one who kind of reached out to me to kind of like tell me about what NBCUniversal was all about, and sort of like the vision behind the whole games team.
Yeah.
And a lot of what he said like really resonated with me. I think just being able to build sort of like a new games team within a company was super attractive to me.
Right.
Because I always like to think I'm a little entrepreneurial. So, taking my startup experience at Scopely and bringing it here and try to build a games team, it presents its own kind of new challenges.
Right.
So I think that was particularly attractive.
Okay.
From a strategic standpoint, I think it makes a lot of sense for a company like NBCUniversal to sort of own the publishing of its games. So I think that part also resonated with me as well.
Okay.
Just thinking about like the mobile landscape and just looking at companies like Zynga and Scopely who have to have these agreements with these big IP holders to secure these IPs to make games off of them.
Right.
It's not a strategy that I think works particularly well. I think it makes more sense when you own the IP, right? Because then you kind of own more of the revenue stream. Right. So I think from a strategic standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. Okay. And Universal has a ton of awesome IP to tap into, so that part was super exciting too.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then just in terms of like for people in the audience who are looking to get into the games industry as a product manager, what advice would you have for them on how do you actually break into the industry and get a job at a gaming company?
Yeah. So I think whenever I interview PMs, I always try to get a gauge for like how big a gamer this person is, because I think that first and foremost is super important to just like have an opinion on games and like sort of like design and sort of like what you would do to improve the game and like think from like the lens of a PM, right? Think about how you would kind of improve games. So I think just like being a fanatic for like games and just playing a ton of them and having opinions about them is super important. So that there's that piece. I mean, I guess like to get more contacts in the industry is like just networking. Like that's, it's so important. And I think that's sort of like what was so valuable about my B school experience, just being able to like meet people in the industry.
And what about skills? Like we you had already mentioned that you think that it's important for PMs to have strong quantitative skills, but are there any specific, whether it's Excel or, ability to do SQL queries, or like what specific things do you think are important for PMs to have in order to like be a good PM or break into the industry? Yeah.
So I think from a hard skill standpoint, you mentioned a couple of them. I think like Excel's pretty important.
Right.
You don't need to be like an Excel wizard, but I think just some level of expertise and familiarity with Excel and just knowing how to manipulate data, because that's such a big and important thing about being a PM.
Right. Cool. So thinking more about the future and how you see the role of a PM kind of evolving, do you see any specific differences from how PMs are today versus the future with respect to whether scope of responsibilities or skills it'll take to be successful?
So I think for that particular question, it really depends on how a particular company is resourced, right? Because we've talked a lot about like what producers do and what product managers do, and to a certain extent what designers do. Yeah. But depending on how like a company is resourced, like the role of a product manager, if there is no producers, becomes that much larger, because you have to think about all the things that a producer would have to think about.
Right.
And then similarly, if there is no real kind of designer, then like there's kind of more responsibility on that front. So I think the role will really depend on like how a company is resourced. Okay. From what I can tell, I think more and more companies, from what I can tell, like have product managers that own more of the production process and like sort of the road mapping. Got it. So that's a model that Scopely follows. That's a model that Zynga follows, from what I can tell. Yeah. So yeah, I think just the overall functional areas will still exist.
Yeah.
Whether it's a producer that does it or a product manager does it
Got
is
it.
another thing.
Right.
And yeah, depending on how a company's resourced, like a producer.
Like how you fill in the
Yeah,
gaps.
yeah, and that's sort of the more
Okay.
more important thing in my mind, like how you fill these functional areas rather than the actual title of who does it.
Okay.
So yeah.
Great. And so, last question. Can you tell me about the Victor origin story? Like from the time that you graduated from whether it's high school or college.
Yeah.
What was your career trajectory, and how did you wind up here at NBCUniversal?
Oh man, wow! I wasn't expecting this question. But I guess to take you back all the way, I was born in 1987, and then grew up in New Jersey, and I guess like just thinking about college, like I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Like I was interested in business.
Yeah.
I was interested in like creative fields too, actually. And
Right.
not many people know this, but I also wanted to get into like film and like kind of the entertainment kind
All right.
of industry. So like I had creative tendencies, which
Okay.
was something I was exploring during the time, but sort of went the business route during college and just studied economics, studied computer science as well. Didn't really know what I wanted to do actually, but after college I had a career in like analytics. So I was working at Barnes & Noble, kind of working on the Nook product, which was the e-reader at the time.
Wow, yeah.
I think it's still a thing now. I think it might be, at the time it was sort of like the Kindle competitor.
Right. Yeah.
The company was putting a lot of like effort behind it, but
Yeah.
I think in recent years it's kind of been dying down a little bit. But it was a really interesting product to be a part of because it was a new industry.
Yep.
People didn't really know about ebooks or
Right.
like how to price them or
Right.
stuff like that. So like that was my major focus while I was there, like understanding how users were kind of using our products and then just understanding like ebook purchasing behaviors.
Right.
And it was like working there that I got to work with PMs and sort of got put onto this whole PM as a career path.
Right.
So took that as an opportunity to go to B school to really explore that, like kind of make that career switch.
Okay. And where did you go to business school?
So I went to business school at UCLA, which is the same business school that you went to, I think.
That's right.
But yeah, so I went there to really break into tech, and that was sort of like my major focus.
Right.
Like again, I wasn't quite sure what company that was going to be,
Yeah.
but what I did know was that PMs got to drive a lot of the kind of execution and strategy behind like products, which I thought was really cool.
Okay.
So went to Anderson, did that for 2 years, interned at Amazon, so I was there for some time, kind of doing some PM things. Got a taste of what PM was like at a big tech company and realized that wasn't something that I was looking for.
Okay.
Again, trying to figure out which company and like which industry was a good fit for me.
Yeah.
And then I sort of met people from the gaming industry and got to learn what PMs did in a gaming context. And I thought that really fit well with my experience being sort of in data analytics, kind of taking the awesome parts of that, getting insights, and then just executing on that.
Right.
Was sort of what attracted me to PM in games, and been in games for the past few years now.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Victor. There you have it. The life of a PM with PM superstar Victor. Thank you very much, and that's it.